Good evening and welcome to the Manuscript Fixes and Flaws, a conversation with independent editors. This is brought to you by Columbia Fiction Foundry. My name is Ken Schept. I'm the president of Columbia Fiction Foundry. We're delighted to have everybody here with us. I'll be moderating this program, and we're really fortunate this evening to have with us four top, amazingly experienced independent editors who will share their knowledge and experience with us. Each editor owns her own business and as well is part of an editorial cooperative called 5E. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Before I introduce them, though, I want to say a bit about Columbia Fiction Foundry and the program that we're having this evening. So Columbia Fiction Foundry is really a group of people, a group of us who simply want to help each other become better writers of fiction, become good literary citizens in that sense. And what we do is hold workshops, several workshops each month, and also programs such as this one that are devoted to either the craft of writing or the business of writing. And the only really membership requirement is to be affiliated or graduate of one of the schools of Columbia University. Uh, if you're a member, that's great. If you'd like to join, our website coordinates should be on your screen. If not, simply Google us, Columbia Fiction Foundry. Very simple to do. So we expect quite a large audience tonight, including alumni from many, many schools of Columbia University, including the School of the Arts, the Writing Division, and the MFA students. So at this point, I really would like to thank the School of the Arts and the Writing Program and Columbia's Alumni Association for helping us get the word out about tonight's program. And a bit about tonight's program, because it's going to be really packed. We have a lot to cover. So we've divided it into four parts. The first part is simply meet the editors. Who are these folks who have been working as editors in the publishing business for many years? How do they work? What can we learn about them um, so that we can do a better job when we require their services? And the second part is insight and advice. What can we learn from these folks that will help us improve our work so that perhaps it can be published? Which leads me to the third part, which is publishing today. And our panelists have deep experience in the publishing world, what it was like before, whatever before means, and what it's like today, because it's changed dramatically for a lot of different reasons, which we'll go into, and try to understand how we need to respond to those changes to succeed. The program is being recorded. It will be on the Columbia Fiction Foundry website next week. But to get started, let's meet our panelists. And to do that, I'd like to turn the program over to a panelist who's been most helpful in helping us organize this program, Leslie Wells. So Leslie, why don't you take it away?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Ken and Columbia Fiction Foundry for having us tonight. First, I'll just say a little bit about 5E. 5E is an independent collective of independent book editors with backgrounds at major publishing houses. We work with clients independently and come together for workshops, panels, and brainstorming sessions. We have deep ties in the literary community, and we love helping writers, agents, and publishers get their best work out there. So that's just a brief little description of the 5E editing group. And now we'll introduce ourselves, the four of us who are independent editors. I'm Leslie Wells. Leslie Wells Editorial is my business. I spent 3 decades in New York publishing at E.P. Dutton, Pocket, and Hyperion, and I was an executive editor at Hyperion. I did become an independent editor in 2012, and I focus on historical fiction, mystery suspense, book club fiction and literary fiction, as well as memoir. I'm also an alum. I got my master's in English Lit at Columbia. So now I'm going to ask Jane Roseman and then Pat Mulcahy and then Sulai Hernandez to introduce themselves in that order. Jane?
Okay, hi. Well, I'm Jane Rosenman, and my business doesn't have a name. It's just Jane Rosenman. But I am not an alum, but I do want to say that I am married to an alum who went to the Columbia College and the journalism school and taught at the journalism school, but is such a nut about Columbia sports, and we've both gotten to be fanatic fans of the Columbia women's basketball team, which is very good this year. And in fact, tomorrow we're heading off to Ithaca for Ivy League Madness tournament. So that's another Columbia connection. I spent many years in-house in publishing, first at E.P. Dutton, then in two different divisions of Simon and Schuster. I was an executive editor at Scribner, an executive editor at St. Martin's Press, and then an executive editor at Houghton Mifflin. Um, and when Houghton Mifflin and Harcourt merged, I was laid off along with my publisher who'd hired me and so forth. And literary agents started calling about projects, and I thought, well, maybe it would make sense to think about leaving in-house. And it's been a wonderful new chapter. I edit fiction and a lot of memoir, but I understand you guys are all doing fiction, at least for now. But I edit literary fiction, I guess what is being called book club fiction. And so I've been doing that since 2012, same as Leslie, and it's been wonderful.
Pat, do you want to introduce yourself?
There we go. Oh, now I'm off. Can you see me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I'll just talk. I lost
Yep.
my
Yep.
visuals, but that never stopped me from talking. I have no connection to Columbia except that my ex-husband got an MBA there. But I love the campus. It's beautiful. I respect anybody who's been through the writing program. I've met many writers who have. I've been doing this for ages. I started out as a temp working for Robert Giroux at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. And years later, decades later, I wound up as editor-in-chief at Doubleday. And like Jane, I was laid off. I wasn't laid off, I was actually fired because once you get to be editor-in-chief, they say, okay, that's that. And it was a time when a lot of very interesting people were getting fired. Right after me, it was Jonathan Galassi, who became editor-in-chief at Farrar, and Godoff, the recently very sadly deceased founder and main editor of the Penguin Press. So that just gives you a little bit of, insight into the turbulence of how one becomes an independent editor. After I left Doubleday, they kept hiring me to work on books. It's almost like in Hollywood when the studio cans you, but then they hire you as a producer to bring in material. And my first job was working with Quincy Jones on his autobiography. And I thought, oh, this is really fun. I wonder if I can make a living at it. And I did. And I worked with a lot of very, very interesting people, Andrea Mitchell from NBC News and others. And over the years, I've done a real mix of projects. I would say that I'm best known in the book world in terms of fiction for crime fiction because I made it to the top of the literary ladder, publishing people like Michael Connelly and James Lee Burke. So I've always loved detective fiction, and I still do. And I also read spy novels and other kinds of suspense-based stories. But I love literary fiction as well. And my company's called Brooklyn Books because I thought I would never leave, but I did. I moved to Queens to save money. You can see there are a lot of twists and turns in the story. And I still love what I do. I feel very grateful to have everybody in 5E. They're great colleagues. We share projects if someone gets something in and feels that it isn't quite right for them. I mean, if you're going to be a really good editor, to work closely with a writer, you have to feel you understand the material and that you understand what the marketplace might be for that book. So we're very collegial in that regard. And that's all I'll say for now. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah.
July?
Hello. I'm really happy to be here. I do have some anxiety about these kinds of things, so forgive me if I I'm like fighting a panic attack at the moment. But so I started out my publishing career with a short stint at a literary agency, somewhat of a notorious one, the Villiano Literary Agency. And from there, I moved on to Kensington Books. And I worked with a really great editor who just like taught me everything I know about editing. And her name was Kate Duffy. And we worked on romance books. And they were fun and quite anyway, and then from there I moved to Simon and Schuster, where I was a generalist. So I got to work on just everything across the board, which was really amazing. So a lot of literary fiction, which is actually my favorite type of fiction, a lot of memoir, a lot of narrative nonfiction. And then I became an independent in 2014. um, well, after Simon and Schuster, I went to a other press. So, and that place is really very literary and also a lot of books in translation. But anyway, I became an independent because I was just, to be quite honest, I am what you call a writer's editor and not a company editor. And I could talk for 1,000 years about what that is, but let's just say that I am really happy owning my own business, which is called Unveiled Ink. And I work on a lot of fiction. I work on a lot of books. But my thing is that I became a ghostwriter in 2017. It was kind of like a hidden skill that I didn't know that I had. And the last few books that I've done are Castor Semenya's, an Olympic champion's memoir called The Race to Be Myself. I worked on Jaleel White's memoir called Growing Up Urkel. I don't know if a lot of you remember that show from the 90s called Family Matters, and so on and so forth. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and that's it.
Thank you
Oh,
for those introductions. We have a remarkable amount of talent and experience. I think where I'd like to start is we writers in the audience know how we spend our days, which is trying to find time to sit in front of a computer and write. And what does your day look like? If you're an editor and you're working on other people's stuff for the most part, how do you structure your day? I mean, are you sitting there in front of your computer? Are you sitting there with a pen and a piece of paper? How does it work? Who would like to start? Jane, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, my life now is obviously very different from the many years I spent in-house as an independent editor. I mean, one of the things that's many things that's wonderful is that's all I'm doing. So
Yeah.
when I work with an author, I ask them to send me the manuscript electronically, and I print it out. And I'm very old school. I write right in the margin of the manuscript. I know that's not good for the environment, but I confess to that sin. And my day, I mean, my work day is really editing, which I do for probably on a good day, it's about 4 hours. That might be, two before lunch or before a
Mhm.
walk or whatever, and then two after.
Mhm.
And then the only other thing of my workday are phone calls with potential authors or phone calls with agents, or once the author has received my work, the manuscript, the writings on the manuscript, I then schedule, if the person lives in New York, that's great. But otherwise, we schedule a Zoom or phone call where we will discuss all the issues that I raise, coming off the manuscript. So it's a pretty streamlined day, which is, very different from in-house.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's been great. It's really enabled me to really do what I love, which is to try to understand what the writer is, trying to do and to help them get to closest to the platonic ideal of that, as we can. So,
Does anybody have spend their day in a dramatically different way, or not do pen on paper, but work off a computer? I'm just looking for a different experience.
Yeah, I don't write on the page. I don't know why. I have some kind of phobia about it, but also I'm very chatty. And if I want to make a comment, I need more space than usually what's in the margin.
Yeah.
So I tell people that my idea of what a novelist would call a read and review, this is getting into categories. Am I jumping ahead? Did you want to
No,
talk?
go ahead. Go ahead.
When I do a read and review, they're usually 8 to 10 single-spaced letters, editorial overview, I call it. And I start it dealing with what I call big picture items, structure, pacing, quality of dialogue, just the general, essence of the book, or at least that's what I'm trying to do. And
Mhm.
then as I've read the hard copy, I've taken extensive notes on a long yellow legal pad. And after I get through a couple pages worth of general comments, I then start giving page references and go step by step by step as to what might be improved, or I try to be enthusiastic. I might say, "Oh, I
Mhm.
love this." You do want to be encouraging because, of course, you're being hired to help someone who probably does need changes made, but you also want to be positive because we all know writing is not exactly a walk in the park.
Mhm. Mhm.
Editors have great empathy for our writers, as Sulai
Mhm.
said. We love working with writers and we want to be encouraging, but we want to be honest. It is not easy to get a book published, and people are wasting their money if you're just going to tell them, "Oh, you're fabulous." We want to say that, but then we want to say, if you want to take that talent and really get an audience for your work, you might consider X, Y, and Z. And I think one of the great things about the backgrounds that we all have is that we've been in publishing houses. We know how people are trying to market. We understand the obstacles for the in-house editors, how they have to speak to their colleagues to try to get things through the pub board. And you've heard book club fiction referenced. That was not a category that existed until about maybe the Oprah Book Club
Yeah.
inception. I can't quite remember. So, you have to be thinking about where this writer might have a shot. At least I try to keep that
Okay.
in the back of my mind. And I also do what I call developmental writing or book doctoring, where I'm helping someone who already has a text, but the intervention that they need is a little bit more than just editing. And I've actually rewritten entire books, which I try not to do now because it's so laborious. I wouldn't call it ghostwriting either, because ghostwriting, you have to start from the ground up.
Okay.
That's what Sulai does,
Let's
where you,
hold that for a second because I want to get more people into the conversation. And we've sort of shifted a bit from, how do you spend your day? How many cups of coffee do you have in front of your computer?
too
Oh, wow.
many,
To,
too
to
many
Oh
in
my
my
God,
Too
case.
so
to
many.
many.
sort of, you know,
Drinking milk.
what are the deliverables? So what we could sort of mix those together while you're reading all these manuscripts and having all this coffee or whatever. What are the deliverables? Because they might differ by editor. Um, what typically if I'm the writer and I've submitted something to you, um, how are you thinking about it? And what should I expect to get back? Maybe Leslie, you want to take a crack at
Sure,
that?
yeah. I mean, I offer two basic services, a read and review, which is a detailed editorial memo. It talks about some of the larger issues concerning that could be pacing, plot, dialogue, character depth, a sort of saggy middle that is not working well with the beginning or the end, the way the whole book is holding together. And then also I include a lot of specific page references to be precise and let the reader see exactly what I'm talking about in the manuscript. And that memo, as Pat said, can run, pages and pages. The other thing that I do is as the other editors do as well, is a full edit, which is editing on the manuscript pages, along with a very detailed editorial letter as well to kind of talk about the larger issues I'm
Mm,
seeing. Also
mm,
mention some specific page
mm,
references in the letter to
mm,
be very clear. Um,
mm,
and that is, takes longer because, I'm really going through and editing, pretty much every page of the manuscript, but it's
mm,
scrutinizing word choices, suggesting sometimes a scene that seems to be implied it should be there, but it is not
mm.
in the manuscript, looking
Yeah.
at repetition, looking at places, particularly if a manuscript's overly long, if it's 95,000 plus words, and that doesn't really work well with the first novel of its type.
Mm.
Looking for places that can be trimmed. I mean, I never suggest trims just because of word count, but typically when a novel gets to be that long, you can see places that can be trimmed. So all those kinds of things go into the both the read and review and the full edit with the editorial letter.
I mean, it sounds a lot like what you do is what we do in our workshops, except you do it on steroids. Um, because I mean that is what we and you also do it with an enormous amount of experience that we do not bring. So Sulai, like I imagine what your process is similar, maybe somewhat different, but the question would be, how long do you, two things. One, how long do you typically spend on a manuscript? Let's say it's a novel length manuscript.
Oh,
And how many manuscripts or clients are you sort of balancing at the same time?
that is such a great question because I think sometimes I mean, I take a while,
Mm.
because I usually like to read a manuscript three times, and I am a fast
Wow.
reader, but I
Yeah.
always read like it's always a three-time process. So the first
Yeah.
read, I'm just inhaling it. The second read, um, it goes a little bit faster, but like the things that are wrong start to like just formulate in my mind. And then on the third read is when I actually start like suggesting things. I used to do everything by hand and I love doing it that way, but now I use track changes. I mean, I still make like notes because I print everything out still. I'm still old school and I'll make like very broad stroke notes. But I do everything in track changes in Word. And I actually recently learned how to use Google Docs,
Mhm.
which is a thing
Yeah,
apparently.
we are.
Oh my God, I cannot stand
Yeah,
this G Drive and these Google Docs, but I'm
yeah,
learning, which is,
that's great. Yeah,
technology.
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I give my clients a 4 to 6 week turnaround period for, a
Mm.
developmental edit, but in terms of hours, I have never like timed myself. I've never
Yeah.
actually like, run the clock on it. But yeah, and I like to work on ideally it's a one client at a time thing.
Okay. Okay.
Um, Although projects can overlap, but never in a real way. I'm
Yeah.
always like ending something and then beginning something else. There might be like a tiny little bit of overlap, but I focus on one
Yeah.
person at a time. And I'm
Definitely.
lucky enough, yeah, I'm lucky enough to be in a situation where I can do that. So
Okay.
yeah.
Couple of follow-up questions to that. The first one is sort of, I'm just curious. I mean, sometimes if you're in a workshop, there are manuscripts you like that you really relate to, and there are others that just are not your cup of tea. But
Mm.
if you're in business, you're reading both. So I'm interested in
Mhm.
Oh, we both share.
what happens if you really love it, or conversely, if you don't. Um, well, that's the first question. Let's do that. And Jane, you were shaking your head.
I only
Yeah.
work on books that I have a feel for. I
Okay.
think, in-house, when you just try to decide whether you want to acquire a manuscript
Yeah.
in-house, the bar is that much higher for reasons we could maybe go into when you want to hear more about,
Yeah.
in-house life. But as an independent editor, I only want to work on something if I, A, have a genuine feel for what the author is trying to do, have a genuine feeling of, being drawn to the material.
Okay.
And I also know the area that the author's writing in. Because you want to have, if you're editing a novel, you want to have in your mind a sort of sense of the landscape of novels in
Mhm.
that area that have worked well, or novels in that
Yep.
area that have been sort of touchstones for you. So I remember a while ago, I don't remember how many years ago it was, I got through a very good agent, a very good manuscript, a novel set in antiquity. And the author, a lot of good credentials, and it was very well written. For whatever reason, I do not have any feel for antiquity. I mean, I'm delighted to go look at antiquity in, Europe or something. But I mean, like, pre whatever, you know, well, anyway, this was real antiquity. I just had no feel for it. I, and I haven't read the kind of classic novels that deal with those with that era. So I recommended it to one of my colleagues. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So
yeah. You
that
don't
we
want to
just,
work with one thing I
yeah.
will just say for everyone who's on this. One thing for you guys to look out for is before you hire someone, make sure you feel that they really have a feel for your work. That's very important.
Okay. Well, let's go down that road a little bit, which is really in the larger sense, the sort of the editor writer or writer client relationship. So I guess, and how does that work in the way you're describing it? Whether you have this affinity between between the editor and the writer, how do you get to that? And also just the nuts and bolts of it. How do you do this? Do you go back and forth on the phone? Is this a lot of emails, a lot of texts? How does it work in that sense? Maybe you go to Pat to start on that.
Yeah, Jane just mentioned sharing with colleagues. So I recently sent something to someone on the screen because I read
Yeah.
it and said, I think this is well done, but honestly, I don't think I'm the right editor. I don't understand the market for women's commercial
Mm,
fiction. If you have never published a book in that arena in all your years of being an editor, if it's not something you would pick up and take on vacation,
hmm
you don't know what you're talking about. You want to really understand the author's perspective. And I really enjoy humor in a manuscript. It doesn't mean it has to be funny for me to take something on, but I would always tell people if I spoke at workshops at writers' conferences, it's like you go to a party. Why do you wind up in a corner with that particular person? Something about them just draws you to it. Perhaps in the case of a novel, you might share some life experience that's being depicted, but that doesn't have to be the case. I've published and edited many, many books on topics about which I knew nothing. But as Jane pointed out, you do want to have some sense of who the ideal reader might be. Again,
mm,
you're keeping that sort of I used to work in-house marketing
mhm.
headset on.
Definitely.
So it's very hard to define exactly what makes you feel comfortable working with someone, but we all, I think, are very much emphasizing that we want the writer to feel comfortable. So I do not really like to talk to people before I read something because, as I've
Mm,
already demonstrated, I'm chatty, and I feel like A, I'm giving away the store, and B, if I really like the person, then I might be a little biased and not be as critical as perhaps one should be.
mm,
So I tell people I'm happy to engage with you personally once I've read a sample and we've agreed that we want to work together. And then I'm happy to go on email. I do a lot of email just because it really helps me formulate my thoughts to put it down, whether it's on a piece of paper or on a screen. But that's how I work. I don't know if everybody else feels that way, but I like to see text. The text is the core.
Totally.
mhm. Anybody else on this general idea of the relationship with the client or the person whose manuscript you're working with?
I also, I think all of us do this. We always ask to see, or I do, I think everybody does. Before, when we're approached by a new client, we ask to see the first couple of chapters that the author's done and also a brief synopsis and what is the total word count. Just again, to get a sense if you have an affinity for the writing, for the general, the synopsis
Mm,
brief, but just where is the novel going? To see if you would be the right fit for the book. And I do usually have, a short call with the author before we
mm,
start working together, just to kind of chat about, just to say hi and just sort of chat about, to understand their expectations, what they're looking for. How long, I always like to hear where the germ of the idea for the novel came from and how long they've been working on the book and things like that. So just a little call. And then when I start working on the manuscript, I just go off and edit. I mean, if I had a question, I would certainly email the author if I had any questions, but I mean, I just usually don't. I just work with the manuscript and focus on that the whole time. And like Sulai said, it's only one project at a time, really. And then after I've sent the edited manuscript or the read and review editorial memo, then we set up a call to talk about the notes once the author has had a chance to, review everything.
And do where does your clientele come from? Is it mostly from referrals? So that there's already sort of a built-in feeling that there's some kind of affinity.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of
Okay.
referrals. Sometimes agents or publishers
Yeah.
call if there's a project. Well, sometimes agents have a project that someone submitted to them where they think it's very good but needs a fair amount of work, and they'll tell the writer that they should probably hire an independent editor to work on it and then resubmit it after it's been edited. And sometimes the publisher has a project. Usually it's a real rush, and
Mm.
it's too time consuming for the in-house editor to
Right.
be able to
Right.
take the time to pull it together in a very quick time frame. So sometimes that happens. But yeah, mainly referrals, or I mean, sometimes people will see your name in the acknowledgments of a book that they liked and contact you for that
Mhm.
reason, which is lovely.
Yeah, I
Anyway.
also have
Yeah.
several friends who are writing teachers,
Okay.
former authors of mine from years ago who are now teaching writing,
Mhm.
creative writing, or I have a good friend at Berkeley who teaches Asian American literature, and I recently worked with one of her students. So it can come both from those kinds of domains and also a lot from agents.
Okay. If it's coming from, well, let's say from somebody from our audience, someone who is not, perhaps not agented, and it's not coming from a publisher, it's coming from a writer. Um, is your goal to make the manuscript as good as it can be, or is your goal to make it publishable? Or does the goal depend on who the writer is?
Go ahead, Jane. I see
Well,
you.
I know, I'm just thinking, well, I mean, I've started to laugh. I mean, of course, it's a great question, Ken. Of course, the goal, the greatest goal of all is to
Mm.
help the writer get published. I mean, that's of course what people want. Um, part of what I see my job as Pat said, to give an honest assessment of, but first of all, we work on the book. I mean, the book is the most important thing. It starts with the book, ends with the book. So the most important thing is to really try to have a very simpatico and constructive and very honest work on the book together.
Mhm.
And then the issue of how publishable it is, how to go about it, that then becomes part of the conversation. I would say that you know I've worked on a good number of books since 2012 that have gotten published, fiction and nonfiction, a lot of memoir. But certainly we do not assume that everything we get is just needs a sort of quick polish and spit and polish and it's on the way to the publisher. So
Mhm.
it's often a pretty long process, and it's a complicated process, and it's a very creative process. And so, like all creative processes, you have to sort of go with how it goes. Um, so I can work with a writer, and then he or she goes off for a year and then says, "I've really worked hard on this. Would you be interested in reading another draft?" That kind of thing. So it's a hard question to answer. I don't know if I've done a good
Okay.
job.
Since we've sort of moved a little bit into sort of from the fixing the craft, which we'll go back to sort of moving into the business part of writing. Um, if you have a client who's writing you're very impressed with, and you have a good relationship with that client, uh, do you see a role in part as perhaps helping that client, that writer get published, making recommendations to publishers or to agents, or does your role end when you deliver the edited manuscript?
That's a hard one. I'm
Okay.
gonna, and the reason is, gosh, because I've come across writers that I've worked with, like unagented writers, obviously,
Mhm.
that I have felt like, oh my gosh, I'm going to make this referral. I'm going to call my friend who's an agent, and and it often does not work, So, and that is, so I always go in, to clients, like making clear that that is not part of like why you're paying me,
Mhm.
because I think it's important that I think it's important to make that clear, because there have been situations where a writer has wanted to hire me, but it's really about and will you refer me to agents,
Mm.
because they know my background and,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
sure. But does that create an awkwardness
It,
because
it can.
you become an intermediary and you have relationships in
I
all
mean,
points of this process?
it
Yeah.
can create an awkwardness. I think if it's like an expected like thing,
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
yeah. But I would love to hear what Leslie, Jane, and Pat have to say about that.
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
go for it.
when I agree, Sue Live, when I start working with clients, I always make it clear that, what they're hiring me for is to edit their book, that I do not promise to refer them to agents or come up with a list of agents for them to, start thinking about submitting to. I'm happy to, if they want to do their research and pass a list by me of agents they've come up with, I'm happy to comment on that. It is very time consuming to look into which agents are pursuing what kinds of fiction, and
Mm,
that can change fairly often. All the agents do have very detailed, good websites, and they typically say what exactly.
sure.
But if the author wants to put a list together after doing the research and run it by me, I'm happy to look at that. I never promise. Yes, if I edit your manuscript, I will, help you be represented, because often there may be a fair amount of pretty large revisions that need to be
Mm,
done that I'm suggesting.
mm,
Plot could change, entire subplots could be cut out, characters may need development, and adding three-dimensionality to a character is very difficult. It's kind of an ineffable thing that, when you're reading a manuscript, either a character is fully fleshed out or there's something missing there, and trying to inject that into a character can be very difficult to do. So what I'm saying is, if I promise to, do that with every client, and yet I haven't read the final version of a manuscript, which, sometimes people want me to read the revisions, sometimes they don't, they want to just move forward after one edit, then it wouldn't be fair to the agent really to just pass everything on,
mm,
because, I don't see the final, if I haven't seen the final
mm.
product, and if
Right.
there's a large amount of revision, I don't know what they would be submitting. So
Okay.
that's why I
All
never
right.
promise.
So it
Promise.
sounds like for many different reasons, it can be a very awkward and difficult position because you're sort of the interlocutor in the middle there,
Well, I'm just
and
very
it's
clear.
flexing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just very clear, so there's no awkwardness. I'm just very clear
Okay.
that,
Yeah.
that's not part of what I do. And then if I do wind up loving something and really feel and read a final draft and really
Mhm.
feel, oh wow, I think this is really
Mm.
something, then I may, but it's never promised. Right? And
Okay.
I never.
Let me stay a bit on this business of a part of this for a second. So, uh, simple question: how are fees structured? I don't mean how much do you charge, but how do you sort of figure out how much to cost? To charge? Is it a matter of the length of the manuscript, the time that you put into it? How does that work? Why don't we just go around really quickly and just sort of one, two, three, how you do that? We don't have to belabor it. Jane, you want to start?
Sure. Well, it took me a while to figure out since I had been,
Yeah,
in-house for, 3 decades. So it took me a while. But what I got to was that I'm very comfortable charging by the hour. I realized that I edit about 20 pages an hour, that has turned out to be a very good template for me. I mean, occasionally it's probably turned out that, I was really a dense manuscript. I wasn't quite making 20, but that's fine. So I charge by the hour. I edit 20 pages an hour. So it's very clear as to what the fee will be. And then I add an hour for all the editorial conferencing afterwards, and that can run longer than an hour, but I just charge that, that 1 hour. So it's very straightforward. It's really very straightforward.
okay. Pat?
Yeah, I operate a little differently. When Sulai said she wasn't quite, paying attention to the time frame, I write like a lawyer. This is the time I started. This is the time I finished that particular
Good.
draft, because I am charging by the hour for the read and reviews. And I'm a really fast reader, but then I take a lot more time with the
Yeah,
letter. Usually, the editorial overview, I wind up going back into the text so thoroughly that you're really getting a bunch of readings for the price of one, as she talked
Sure.
about also. And I'm just a fast reader because I've been doing it so long. So I try to give people a very fair rate because I like to attract both new writers. We work, a lot of us in 5e, with the emerging fellows at the Center for Fiction in Brooklyn.
Hmm.
And they are literally still taking courses, and many of them have been to Columbia, I know. And I also work with, I don't work with celebrities anymore. I work with some highly placed people, though. If I'm doing a job, I don't do a lot of line editing. I do what I call this book doctoring thing, where it's more rewrite. I'm not working from the ground up, as you do if you're a ghost, but I'm really doing extensive revamps. And when
Hmm.
that's the case, I have to charge a lot more money. And I try and estimate based on the years I've been doing this, how many bills I need to pay in the months this is going to take.
Sure.
And it can get very complicated. I worked with the authorized biographer of Fred Rogers, the child television star. And we got so immersed in rewriting this book so that it would appeal to a very commercial audience because he started out doing so much research. It read like a university press book. It took 2 years to rewrite this book, and I wound up being broke. And luckily, the author
Mm.
was in a position to give me
Mm.
a little bit of an advance to keep me going. And the book wound up being a bestseller, and everybody was thrilled.
Okay,
But
well, that's a good story at
did
the
I
end.
ever think I was going
Yeah.
to work on it for
All
two
right.
years?
Let's
No.
let me keep that moving. Sulai, did you want to talk about that? How you structure your fees?
Um, this is interesting. There was, I think it was Leslie once who told me, why don't you just charge by the word? Like, do you remember saying that to me?
Yeah, yeah, word count. Word
Word count. And it was, you know what? I was like, once I did it, I was like, oh, this actually makes sense. It makes sense. So I do that, and so that would be like for developmental edits. But when it comes to these other like the what I call like ghostwriting projects or collaboration projects, usually that's a negotiation like with the agent, and it's they have a number in mind and it's a lot, it's really easy, meaning it's a lot easier than the than calculating like with an independent, with a writer. So, but yeah, but the word count thing, that works out for me
Oh,
perfectly. So.
Leslie, are you still word count or are you doing something else?
Yes, I pretty much know based on word count how long it also ties into how much time obviously you will spend with
Yeah.
the script. So based on the word count, I have a good sense of, how long it will take me to edit. So if a manuscript is 75,000 words, if it's 100,000 words, I have fees, based on that length of manuscript. And then also a read and review for me that's a memo, a detailed editorial memo is a little more than half of the cost of a full edit on the manuscript page with an editorial letter. So, if the full edit and a letter was going to be $10, the read and review might be $6, just to, throw those numbers out there. Um,
That's per word, Leslie?
No.
uh, I mean, those numbers are not correct. I'm just using an analogy.
As a comparison. Okay.
Never
All
work.
right. Let's let's move off this sort of. I'm going to move to the next sort of topic. As I said in the beginning, the first was sort of getting to know the you folks, the editors, and the next is sort of what can we learn from what you do, sort of the insights and advice. And the first question is, how do you know when you need an independent editor? What signals does the writer look for to know that, well, I've taken this as far as I can take it? And I want to be pretty specific because before this, at least one person sent us a question, and I'll read this question verbatim. Uh, I finished I have a finished novel that's 117,000 words. It's been written, rewritten, revised, workshopped, cut by 23,000 words. Do I need an editor before I query? So I would say answer the general question and the specific question, if you can. But that's sort of, I think, illustrative of what people in the audience are thinking. Where am I, and when do I know I need your services? Uh, Jane?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I mean, to a certain extent, it's a little hard to answer without, more specific context.
Yeah.
But I would say that if the writer really feels that he or she is, pretty far along. It's been as a written, rewritten workshop. Really, they've taken it as far as they can, and they're serious about getting published, and they're working in a area that, seems, plausible. I think it is a very good idea to get an independent editor because number one, the book can probably be improved. That length is very long. So I would urge the author to think about getting an editor just for that reason alone. But the other thing, which Pat mentioned at one point, which is I think one of the key things about what we offer, is that we all were acquiring editors for fiction at major publishing houses. So you go to the editorial meeting, you're very excited about something you've read. Your editor in chief calls on you, okay, Jane, what do you have today? I had to learn how to really describe a novel in a way that the editors, the publisher, the editor in chief, if there was
Mm,
a salesperson, head of publicity says, "Hey,
mm,
that sounds
mm.
really good." So that can be a huge help to
Yeah,
the writer who hires an independent editor who's had real in-house experience because
yeah,
we're thinking backwards all the time as well as
yeah,
forwards.
yeah.
So and I think also if you've worked on something for a long time, you have a day job, you have a family, whatever, working with a really well-placed independent editor gives you, it's a marvelous way to get a real sense of what you have, what you don't have, how likely is this worth moving forward on? And it's also a way to kind of get around the gatekeepers because you can query 50 agents and you might not hear from one, this person who asked you the question. Whereas if you work with a really good editor, you come away with a huge amount of you know data, a huge amount of feedback, and so you skip a bunch of the steps.
Thank you. That's very clear.
Yeah.
Sulai, any thoughts?
Um, well, I mean, I think this is interesting because a recent client of mine has been working on a novel for 21 years. And she finally got an agent, and she got a great agent.
Mm,
Um, but then the agent is like, you know what? I can't quite like get this to where, she was working on the novel on her own for 21 years and managed to get
mm,
an agent on
mm,
her own.
mm,
But then the
mm,
agent, right. So, and
mm.
now it's with me, and now it's an interesting,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah. So it's kind of like the opposite of what Jane was. I'm sorry, I
Mhm.
think I might
Mm.
have like
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
lost,
that's
yeah, yeah.
no, that's fine. But I
I
mean,
lost the,
I think the next question that I have after what I took away from what you said, Jane, is that there's almost a hidden benefit to working with an independent agent,
Yeah.
which is you actually know what your story's about, what your novel's about. Here's all the words I wrote, but one of the hardest things to do is actually to compress all that down and to
Right.
say what
Yeah.
it's really about. And once you can do that and you can write the synopsis, the
Right.
query, the pitch, then you have something to sell.
Huge, huge.
So, which leads to this question. Do you offer that service? In other words, if you've already done the work,
Mhm.
do you also help with
Mhm.
pitches, queries, synopses?
Yes.
Yeah, and
yeah,
this
Leslie,
yeah.
well, Leslie, you're shaking your head. So what's your answer?
Yes, I'm always happy to edit the
Yeah.
query letter and
Yeah.
a synopsis. I mean, it's true. Once you've read a manuscript and edited it, you do have a
Yes.
very strong sense of where its strengths are and what the
Mhm.
themes that should be emphasized in a pitch. Sometimes it can be very hard for an author to describe that because they're so close to the material. So yes, it's definitely
Yeah.
and
very
Ken,
yeah.
I just wanted to add, Ken, also that a benefit of being with any of us, and we
Yeah.
have two excellent colleagues who aren't here tonight, Ann
Right.
Horowitz and Judy Sternlight, is that 5E sponsors these sessions called office hours on Zoom. And
Okay.
we have things like how to approach agents, how to write a query letter, how to write good dialogue. Lately, we've been having guests. We had a session on small press publishing. We're working on one on, what's happened to book reviewing, this kind of thing. So, in addition to getting our individual services on your manuscript, you are getting a treasure trove of free Zooms on some of these issues that you've just asked about.
Okay. And for people who are listening to take advantage of that, they could just go Google 5e editorial and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they'd find your website
Yep.
basically. And
Yep.
that's how you would get to those
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
services. Okay.
we don't have those up for the new season quite yet. We're still compiling the guest list and so
Okay.
on,
But
but
that's
soon, soon.
obviously very, very helpful. Um, Staying on this idea of what we could learn from you guys. So this is, I mean, this is going to be a very general question, but again, people who are on this call are all in our workshops, and we're all trying to help each other become better writers. As you're looking at manuscripts, are there sort of these typical flaws, going back to the title of this program, that you constantly find structure, character, voice, whatever it is? And I'll add another question, then you can sort of deal with it how you jump in where you feel you'd like to. And if you're writing a novel, is the problems that you usually find, where do they fall? In the beginning, in the sagging middle, at the end where it doesn't quite end the right way? The larger question is, everybody is writing something. Most people listening are writing a novel. Um, what's sort of that top line advice? Here's the biggest problems that we constantly run into. Anybody? Jane, do you want to?
Well, I would say, I mean, obviously Eddie and all, it has to, um, the first things, it has to come alive. It has to feel believable. The characters have to feel like people that, you might recognize if they walked in the room, or if you didn't recognize them, you were intrigued by the fact that you didn't recognize them. In terms of, I would say that for me, one of the things I really look for, besides all the aspects of craft that you guys know about, is a sense of import. I've edited a lot of literary fiction and in-house and now, out of house. And there's a tendency you can have beautiful sentences, lovely descriptions of a snowfall and all that. But the story is kind of underpowered. Um, I mean, you want the reader to feel like he or she is really invested in the outcome. And the level of suspense obviously depends on the genre. Obviously, this is going to be different than, what Pat was mentioning about suspense novels. But even so, I think in any piece of fiction, you want to feel invested in the outcome. You want to care about what's going to happen to the characters. Or the voice is so compelling, you want to see how it gets resolved in that way. Um, a writer like Paul Auster, I would say, who probably some of you have read, the voice is so compelling that it's almost like the voice becomes a character. So, I mean, there are a lot of different ways to play it, but I think it is that sense of something is at stake.
Mm,
Because when a person buys a book and then reads it and finishes it, I mean, they want to feel that that book has, made an imprint on them. And so I think that's something I often see where the writing is excellent. The person's really smart. They really know what they're doing, but I'm not quite getting the sense of what is compelling me through.
right. Right. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I would say that something Jane mentioned, too much description. If I start reading a novel and there are pages and pages of setup descriptive copy, I'm wondering, does this have a plot? Is there going to have anything happening? And the other issue that you mentioned, Ken, saggy. I just read a letter yesterday to a young writer. Oh, pardon me, I'm getting scratchy throat. I don't know why. Take a little sip of water. And I said to him, every novel I read has a saggy middle, every single one.
Uh,
The writer doesn't know when to stop. They're a little nervous. They're not totally confident. And they keep pounding away that maybe they've had a good beginning. And then things start going saggy. Then maybe they pull it together and have a good ending. This writer certainly did. And I
mm,
said, you don't have that much work to do. Just cut out X, Y, and Z chapter in
ah,
the middle, which is a
yeah,
repeat of what you've already
yeah,
said.
yeah, yeah.
And you can feel confident then to move on and get to that good ending. Keep
Right,
those pages turning.
right, right. So sort of liposuction is the answer to all of this. Okay,
Yes,
baggy middle, done.
saggy middle.
Saggy middle.
I have a thought too. I so often recommend that when the plot is just not holding together, or sometimes in the middle, the author will become sort of distracted by a new subplot or introduce a new set of characters that seem kind of tangential to the main storyline. So I really think it's helpful to do an outline at the beginning. The
Interesting.
outline is going to change a lot as you're writing, but I think often an author starts writing. They have a great idea for a novel and they just sort of start writing without really having a sense of where the book is going. And again, the outline is going to change. You don't have to be pedantic about it, but just to have an idea of, okay, by chapter 5, I want these things to have happened. By chapter 7, this character will be introduced. Chapter 9, you're getting toward maybe the last third of the book. By chapter 9 or 10 or whatever, I want these things to have occurred. And then the denouement, leading to the final conclusion. Just so you have a sense of the layout of where you want your book to go and where you want certain events or incidents and characters to come into the book and what they're going to be doing. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to move on to the next section, which is sort of publishing today, and and move off of sort of this insights and advice, but recommend that people go to your website, as I will, to take advantage of the uh, videos that you just mentioned. When it comes to publishing, I think you're a really perfect group to have this conversation with because, as you described in your bios, you were in publishing before, you're in publishing now. Publishing has changed dramatically. Um, what are the changes that perhaps most make it either easier or more difficult for the people in the audience who are, for the most part, debut authors, not exclusively, but for the most part, to either to find a publisher or to find an agent to somehow crack into the industry? I mean, is the supposition correct that it's harder now than when you started out? And if it is, why is it? How is it harder? And what recommendations might you have to navigate the industry today? And I know that's a mouthful, but I folded in a lot of questions. Leslie, any
I
thoughts?
do think it is more difficult today to get representation and to be published because of all the conglomeration. I mean, there used to be, many, many houses in New York and some in Boston that were, major publishers, and agents just have a smaller pool to submit to. I mean, there are 5 main houses in New York now. Certainly, there are lots of imprints within those houses, but still, there's just a smaller pool for submissions, and therefore, agents are becoming more, I think, more particular. I think their bar is even higher in terms of what they accept. The other thing is, I do feel that in-house editors have less time for actually sitting and editing. So I think sometimes agents
Oh,
feel that they really want the manuscript to be 95% perfect before they
there.
take it on. And that is different. I mean, as an acquiring editor, you used to be able to take on a manuscript and see its flaws, realize that it was very, very good, still needed work. I have the feeling that that is not so much the case in-house now. So I think the bar is much higher with agents to get representation. On the plus side, I think there's been a lot of exciting things with small presses, hybrid presses. Writers are finding, really exciting new ways to get their work out there. So that's the plus side of all that.
Sure. Anybody else?
Well, we just had a report from the London Book Fair
Yes.
in Publishers Lunch, the newsletter that's so informative. And I would encourage everybody to subscribe to Publishers Marketplace, even for a month or two, because they have all the up-to-date news on deals, who's making what deals. If you're really that far along, this is beyond getting our help with your actual material, but you're ready to look for an agent, think about publishing, where you might, aspire to publish. They have search bars where you can put in spy novel sold this week, and then you can see the write-up on that. So Jane and I both taught a course once at the 92nd Street Y called "You Finished Your Novel. Now What?" question mark. And I would just sit there with my computer and pull up Publishers Marketplace and go through it step by step and show people how to see how this works because it's a
Mhm.
system. And the system is now very data heavy and data intensive. Anyway, Publishers Lunch, the daily newsletter, said today, what are the big topics at the London Book Fair?
Mm.
AI and short attention spans.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is what we are
Yeah.
dealing with in today's
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And that's why I think all of us emphasize to writers have a wonderful beginning to your book.
Yeah.
Because if you don't grab the eye of the reader you're looking for in the first 30 to 50 pages, you
Right.
are,
Yeah,
in a lot of
yeah,
trouble.
yeah.
People don't have the patience. And I know people are still reading fiction, but they're also watching an incredible amount of very good drama on
Mhm.
streaming services. And those tend to be very well plotted. And there's a big overlap between people that watch, HBO shows and BritBox, of which I'm a big fan, and good readers, people who like a really
Mhm.
good story in whatever format. So
Mhm.
this puts almost additional pressure on people, I think, to really have a plot to help people immerse themselves. And as Jane talked about, feel like they're really connecting with something in that book that's illuminating
Mhm.
what they're thinking
Mhm.
about.
Okay. Which is similar to something Jane had said earlier, I believe. Related to that, again, with the idea that those of us in the audience and myself who are have something they want published, a lot of what I'm looking for is, are you seeing? I'm trying to get a description of what you are seeing. Are there particular genres that you're seeing more of today or trends that you can identify that would be helpful to people in the audience because that's either what they're writing or thinking about writing? Or conversely, are there gaps in the market where you're thinking, oh, I haven't seen this for a while. This could actually be an interesting, uh, proposition for a book. So either a lot of stuff that you're seeing or gaps where you're not seeing it. Anybody?
Well, I mean, if I were in-house, I probably would feel a little bit more equipped, Ken, to
Yeah,
answer
yeah,
your question, because
yeah,
of course I would be getting many, many submissions from, agents every day.
yeah.
I would say I can't see the people attending this, but my guess would be that there are people who are probably not writing. Well, maybe this may be not true, but in general, maybe probably not writing in certain genres that right now I think are very popular. Like there's this whole thing of sort of combination of romance and fantasy, known as romantasy. If I had
Hmm.
to bet,
Hmm.
maybe not that many of you guys are doing it, but there may be some. So I don't know. That's I mean, there are all sorts of genres that you can research that are, much hotter than they used to be. And, certainly fantasy is huge. But I think my sense is that the best thing for the people listening to this is to have an really understanding of what they're writing and have a few really strong comparative titles that are honest, that remind them of what they're trying to do in some way, shape, or form. And having a few really important titles can be
Subtitles.
hugely
Yeah,
helpful.
yeah, yeah,
Comparative
yeah,
titles,
yeah.
hugely helpful. If I
Um,
see that, if someone writes me and they say I'm working on this thing, and they mention on my bio, they mention a writer that I had worked with in house or out of house, and they say it sort of puts me in mind of what I'm doing. I think, okay, this person's done their research and they have a real understanding of what they're trying to do. So I don't think trying to suss out the market, particularly
okay.
for fiction.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Okay, that's good. So do what you're doing.
But do
Don't
it. Yeah,
don't try to anticipate the trend because you're going to miss
right.
it anyway, and just do
Exactly,
the best you can on
exactly,
what's in your gut.
exactly.
I'm gonna move to some of the Q&As so that people in the audience have an opportunity to ask their questions because we want to leave a little time in the end for a summary. So, first question, and this is sort of, I think, sort of nuts and bolts. You have mentioned developmental editing, reading and review, editorial review. Would you please tell us about the various types of edits and how they're different? Additionally, I come from a journalism world where there are differences perhaps between a line editor, story coach, copy editor. What are the various types of book editors, and how do you determine which
Right.
type you need?
Very good question. Well, developmental editing, I would say, is generally all the things that are might be keeping you, all the obstacles that might be in the path of you getting an agent and getting published. So it's not so much line editing, because no book I think ever did or didn't get sold on the basis of one word choice or something. I
Right.
think it's at least this is how I work. I'm really and it's it's an expensive process too. So I don't want to have the author run up a huge bill. So I'm really looking at, in particular for fiction, what are the really big issues, plot, character, voice, all the above. And that I call a full developmental edit. And several of my colleagues can talk about how that differs from the read and review.
Well, interestingly, this is a good question because recently, one of the 5E colleagues who's not here today referred me to an agent who had a Hollywood-based client, and he had a material for a cop story he wanted to write, and he wanted a developmental editor. And I thought, okay, maybe he needs, help with pacing. You really have to have a story like that move. And he sent 16 pages. It was what we used to call a treatment. It was just a vague outline. And the developmental editor, potentially me, was supposed to like sit there and write the book with him. I said,
Oh,
no,
God.
that is not developmental editing. That is co-writing, and you have to give me royalties and so on and so forth. I don't think this is what you want. And frankly, I was not up for the assignment, so I politely declined. But he seemed to have a certain idea of developmental editing, which is not mine. Developmental editing to me is what Jane said, where you're focusing more on big picture, but I give that at the beginning of my read and reviews. So it kind of all melds together, but it's very distinct from line editing. I don't do much line editing because it is very expensive. And
Mhm.
I try to give such detailed notes that the writer will be able to respond in a way that will get them to the same place. At least that's the goal.
Right. And if I can just clarify one thing, and I'm going to shut up, is that one of the reasons that I like writing right on the manuscript is that I can say, I'm not quite understanding this character's motivation at this moment. It's bugging
Mhm.
me. And
Mhm.
then 25 pages later, the author actually gets to that. So, when I get to that, I'll say, okay, well, now you see what I was feeling. So in that case
Mhm.
like that, maybe they want to move it up 20 pages, maybe they don't, but I'm giving them in real time what an average reader might feel at that moment. So I like the very granular nature of really doing it moment by moment, but definitely with an eye towards the big picture. I think spending a lot of money on intricate line editing, I mean, I just my feeling is it's the other things that are really crucial.
I've only done that when the publisher's paying me. When
Yeah,
they say, this person has a platform, so we're going to publish the book,
yeah,
but it needs a whole lot of work.
yeah.
And then that immersive treatment, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars, but they feel they can afford it because they know the book's going to sell, or they think it will.
Okay. And that's from a publisher as opposed to an individual
Yes.
writer. So the economies change.
Mhm.
Yeah, and now I haven't had a job like that in ages, because people are all trying to save money. And again, as Leslie pointed out
Right.
before, most material that does come in, is in much better condition than it might have been X number of years ago.
Right.
Okay.
But people still do rewrites.
I want to go back to the Q&A so more people have an opportunity to ask questions. The next two are a little bit more nuts and bolts, I think. So, and it might relate to this idea of ways to economize. Have you tried AI for summarizing or editing transcripts? And do you know if publishing houses are doing that or doing other things with AI? And then there's a more general question of what do you think about AI, which is the big question, which probably nobody knows, but that is the question. How would AI affect, impact, transform publishing? But the first question is, do you use it at all? Do you know if publishers use it?
Sulai does.
Yeah,
Oh,
100%. I mean, I'll just say this, right? I am like kind of new to AI, but I'm interested in it, right? It's definitely not to edit, not to rewrite, but I'm
Mhm.
interested in it as a tool, right? And I remember when we had this meeting, me and my 5E friends here, my colleagues here, and I was trying to explain, I'm like, if we, it is in the beginning, it was like super scary, and I'm like, this is coming after our jobs, we're like, we're done, it's over for us. But it really doesn't feel that way to me after I've like, sort of played with it a bit. It could never replace what we're doing right now, right? This like this back
Mhm.
and forth and the way that we relate like to a client, to an author, there's just nothing at all. But it is an incredible tool. So, for example, one of the things that I used it for that was really incredible was I was working on a biography with a client. And one of the first things that I do when I work in a biography is I create a timeline of every single, and I used to do that like by hand after my 3 readings. And that could take me 2 to 3 weeks, right? Of like this very detailed timeline of the actual manuscript. With AI, that can be done in 2 minutes.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So I say, and obviously it is true that AI hallucinates, right? So you still have to like review every single thing, just to make sure that it's correct. But what it did was it gained me all of this extra time that I could actually spend like with my client, doing the
Oh,
things
okay.
I love. You
Okay.
see what I mean? So
Yeah.
it has
So,
freed my mind up
right.
to be more creative and more present for my client, as
Right.
opposed to like it cannot do like my work for me, but it can
Right.
help me do like
It's an efficiency tool that
it's
opens
an
up more time
efficiency
for
tool.
you to do what you want to do, where your expertise is.
Exactly that. And I think that if we can sort of like approach it in that way, right,
Okay.
that it would be less scary. But in my mind, I am like I was concerned when I read some reports, and I don't know where I read it, but that publishing companies were literally like feeding books,
Mhm.
published books, into the
Well,
AI machine.
yeah, that's a whole other issue that has to do with
Yeah, yeah.
intellectual property rights.
Property.
Then
Yeah, yeah,
then
Right,
you just put your stuff, dump it into the
right.
AI factory. I
Yeah.
want to go to the Q&A again. Another sort of a nuts and bolts question, which is um, it has to do with self-publishing. Getting a manuscript through an agent or publisher is a tough road, which we've already discussed. Have you worked with writers interested in self-publishing? Is this a role you shy away from? What is your experience? And there's a lot of different kinds of
yeah,
self-publishing
yeah.
as well and different models, but do you have any thoughts about that? Or is
I
that
remember
some, yeah,
acquiring like
yeah.
several writers who were self-published like while I was at Simon and Schuster and other press, because
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
yeah, oftentimes, self-published writers, if they like find some success, I mean, then the big five or traditional publishers are interested in
Hmm.
making money off of them or with them. But I still work with writers who are only interested in self-publishing. And yeah, and it's really great. Like people who don't want to follow the traditional model because they have this idea that they can be much happier, if they can control more of their project.
I
Right.
think fiction is tougher. I've worked with a couple of authors since leaving in-house, nonfiction authors, where it was a nonfiction. It was a kind of um, uh, sort of one was anyway, nonfiction where it's kind of very topic driven, and the author has a very strong platform and idea of where he or she can sell the books. If it's an
Hmm.
authority on something and they speak at, 50, 25 professional conferences a year kind of thing. That can be a very good model for self-publishing. For fiction, my sense is the fiction that has worked the best, and Sulai might correct me, is genre fiction. So romance,
Right.
fantasy, that there
Thrillers.
yeah, people have
Yeah.
had great success. So I think it depends on what you're writing.
I
I
think
think the literary
also,
fiction is tough.
I think crime fiction also, Jane, I would put into that genre category. I don't know if you've read S.A. Crosby, the people here, but he is a real talent. He's an African American man who's actually married to an undertaker who
Hmm.
lives in rural Virginia. He had a very small local press in North Carolina. I think he's in North Carolina. No, Virginia, I'm sorry. Anyway, because he did have an actual published book, even though it was a small press, he was invited to a local panel. There happened to be an agent in the
Yep,
audience.
yep,
Wow.
yep,
He said,
yep,
I love how this guy
yep,
talks.
yeah.
And he approached him. He found him a very interesting character, married to an undertaker, very rootsy Southern guy. And this man is now an absolute, he's blown up, as
Yeah,
the
yeah,
kids say,
yeah.
in the crime field. He's a tremendous talent. He's won Edgar's. He started out with a very tiny press, but he managed to get
Yep.
himself noticed. So there are
Yep,
conferences,
yep,
there are book
yep.
fairs. You have to schmooze, but there's nothing wrong with starting small, spreading the word, getting your book talked about, getting your book seen at fairs and so on and so forth. You have to be an entrepreneur, yes. But there are people who've got these stories.
And
Definitely.
book talk. Book talk is a thing.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so and that seems to go back to the idea of this evolving publishing industry, and in this sense, there are other options, and for some people, self-publishing might be a good option. Let's go back to the Q&A. We have a little over 10 minutes left, and I want to leave enough time at the end for you folks to sort of summarize what you do and how people could reach you. So, this is a nuts and boltsy thing. Among software used for formatting manuscripts, do any of you have a preference for Living Writer, Scrivener, Storylist, Final Draft? And if so, what program is your preference? Does it matter one way or the other?
I've never used any of these.
I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
I just like the words on the page.
doc.
I
Oh,
mean,
my Word doc.
Yeah, we want
Double
words.
space, please.
Words. Okay, you guys want words.
Office, Microsoft 360.
yeah.
Simple.
No more than 250 words a page.
Yeah, but yes, okay. But we were moving into what else? Google. We're moving to Google Docs too. I think we
Yeah.
touched on that earlier. So,
Yeah.
there are a couple of questions here which I think we covered, unless I'm misreading them, which have to do with this idea of reaching out to an agent or publisher. So, I think the question is. Or I'm summarizing, it's unlikely that you're going to reach out to an agent or publisher on behalf of a client. Sometimes manuscripts come to you that way. Would you get a manuscript from an agent who asks you to clean it up, or
Oh,
from a
absolutely.
publisher?
All the
Yeah,
time.
it
All the
works that
time.
way
All
more
the
than
time.
and this sort of relates to this self-publishing. Question is, any feelings or ideas about online publishing?
You
I
mean
guess
online
uploading,
self-publishing?
uploading your work to some
Oh,
virtual
like on
website.
Amazon? I
Oh,
remember.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Have you worked with manuscripts where the client wants to then submit to Amazon and have it published through Amazon or another online publisher?
Not too much, although Leslie or Jane, didn't someone work with She Writes, a hybrid
I've
publisher?
worked with She
Oh,
Writes several
hybrid.
times. I've worked with,
Is
yes,
She
several
Writes
times.
online, or do they
No.
provide physical books?
No,
or
definitely physical books,
Oh, they
definitely.
do. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Um,
I had.
And that's a hybrid publisher,
yeah,
which
it's
is
called She
where,
Writes Press. And
okay.
yeah, I know we're running
And,
out of time, so I won't go too much into that. Yeah.
but that's where the writer takes some of the financial risk in
Some of them,
that
yes, exactly.
self-publishing model.
Exactly. It started by a woman who had very good roots in-house publishing.
Okay. Quick last question. I think we covered this. Please define saggy middle. I think we did that. But
Saggy middle means you're bored. I write in the
okay.
letter,
You're
I
bored
am
halfway
bored
through.
here.
Yeah. Okay.
You've already made this point, or I've already seen this character that he had a whole series of girlfriends who started to blend together. let's have two girlfriends instead of five.
Okay.
That kind of thing. Saggy middle means interest is being lost.
Okay. Before we go to sort of summarizing, are there, any references or writing books or editing books that you folks use that you would recommend? As we're writing, this would be a good thing for us to keep on our shelf or on our desk. Anything?
There's Vivian Gornick's book called The Situation in the Story. And I love that book. And I went to Sarah Lawrence, for undergrad and graduate, and I remember she was one of my writing professors, and she was just absolutely amazing. But anyway, her book, The Situation in the Story, is amazing. And always Stephen King's On Writing.
It's
Yeah,
I reread that every
fantastic
two
book.
years.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
and Anne Lamott, Bird by Bird, I like a lot.
Yeah.
Elizabeth McCracken has a really good book about writing. Yeah, but on writing, people are surprised about that. It's part memoir, amazing, very short book, just incredible. And it's not about horror, it's not for horror writers.
Okay.
Yeah, really good
Thank
read.
you. And that summary sort of illustrates the benefit of this evening, that you've shared so much knowledge and insight with us. It's certainly helpful to me. For those listening, I hope it's been helpful to you as well. In the last few minutes, what I'd like to do is go around and have each of the four of you, I guess, summarize for the people in the audience where you could be helpful and how they could reach you, in a minute or two, and then we'll wrap it up. Leslie, why don't you start?
Well, I can be helpful if authors are working on historical novels, book club fiction, mystery suspense, literary fiction. As I mentioned, I also work with a fair amount of memoirists. And I either do a read and review, which is a detailed editorial memo, or a full edit on the manuscript on the pages, along with an editorial letter. And my website is Leslie Wells Editorial. And yes, that's how to reach me. Thank you.
Okay. Jane?
Um, well, I don't have a website. But I have a full bio, which is listed on the 5e website. And one thing I would say is I list in there a lot of the writers, both fiction and nonfiction, that I worked with in-house, that I published in-house, and a lot on what I've done since. So, take a look at that, see if there are writers I've worked with that you admire their work. You can, get a sense of the editor through. I'm very interested in Judaica, both in fiction and nonfiction, but certainly a lot of fiction. Keenly interested in psychology. If you study what the editor has worked on, you can glean a pretty good sense. And anyone who's interested, you can just email me at rosenmanjane. It's just my name reversed at gmail.com. And I'm always happy to answer email. Email is a great way to reach me.
Thank you, Jane. Patricia, Pat?
Yeah, I just redid my website because I've been doing this for so long. I said, okay, I have to put some contemporary material up here so people don't think I'm out to pasture. So I spent some money on a jazzy website with all kinds of colors and bells and whistles, which I normally wouldn't do. But I really enjoy my work. It's so inspiring and educational to work with writers on books. And I've learned so much over the years. And I just really, really enjoy it, and I'm glad to keep going. And there is a contact thing on my website so that you can contact me directly. And I love email. I'm not looking at anything in particular. I have a really varied range of interests, not just crime fiction, but literary fiction, pop culture. I worked with Quincy. I've worked with Joey Brown's younger brother on this wild memoir about punk rock. I'm open to many things, but you can see the range on the website, and I'd be glad to hear from people. I just try to be helpful in whatever way that I can.
Thank you, Pat. And Sulai?
I am going to echo Pat and to say that you can reach me on my website, which has not been updated, but you can get a pretty good idea of my range. It's www.unveiledinc.com. And yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, this has been great. Really,
Yeah.
thank you
Yeah.
guys.
Thank you.
Oh,
And
I forgot to say it's
I-
brooklynbooks.com or patriciamulcahy.com
Oh,
goes into that. So it's all united.
Okay. And also, I guess if people if your individual websites went by too quickly, they could just Google 5E or
Mhm.
yes,
5E,
Yes,
yes, yes,
and
yes,
that's where
yes,
the cooperative's website is, and that's also where we can find all of the videos and other
yes.
uh, literary help
Yeah, yeah,
tools that you have.
yeah.
So that sort of brings us to the end of the program. I thank you, the
Yeah.
four of you. Thank you, Leslie, in particular, for helping us sort of organize this, and Jane, Pat, and Sulai. Um, I think it's been really informative for me. I hope for the audience as well. Um, for those of you who are not members of Columbia Fiction Foundry in the audience, we'd love to have you join us. Go to Columbia Fiction Foundry. Our coordinates may be on the screen. If not, you can find them on Google. Very easy to do. Hope to see everyone in a workshop soon. And beyond our workshops, here are the people who can help all of us improve our writing. So, with that, uh, good luck with your writing. Good luck with your editing. Thank you very much.